Hey, curious wanderer, where in the world are you watching this video from? A place where penguins waddle, or maybe where the sun never sets? Type your city and country in the comments. Let's make this a global party. And if you enjoy the madness here, share it with your favorite humans. All right, adventure time. The DJ at the reception seemed almost gifted in one particular way, Sophie thought sourly. Every track he queued up was somehow one of her least favorites. She hadn't wanted to attend this wedding to begin with. The only reason she was here at all was because Ryan had insisted. The groom was his former college roommate, and Ryan had framed it as a duty more than an invitation. Now where had he wandered off to? Her gaze swept the crowded room until she spotted him propped against the bar, deep in animated conversation with a man she didn't recognize. Perfect. That left her stranded at the table, feeling even more out of place than she had at her own high school reunion. She sank into her chair, wishing she could disappear altogether. "Hey!" The sudden call jolted her upright. She turned toward the doorway and saw a woman about her age, grinning broadly and holding a cocktail glass aloft. "Tina?" Sophie's voice jumped an octave in surprise. "You're kidding me! What are you doing here? It's been forever!" The two women rushed into a quick hug, laughing at the coincidence. When they pulled apart, Tina motioned toward the man standing beside her. "Sophie, meet Dylan, my boyfriend. Dylan, this is Sophie, my best friend back in high school." Sophie greeted him politely, though her eyes darted over him curiously. Dylan was tall, easily 6'2", with jet black hair slicked neatly away from his face and a faint stubble shadowing his jaw. A small silver hoop glinted in one ear. Unlike the men in suits circulating around the room, Dylan wore black jeans and a worn leather bomber jacket over a plain t-shirt, casual and defiant all at once. So Tina went and landed herself a bad boy, Sophie thought, a tiny sting of envy cutting through her surprise. The couple slid into the empty chairs beside her, and within minutes, Sophie and Tina were lost in an animated exchange, racing to cover the years they'd missed. Dylan stayed quiet, leaning back with an amused half-smile, scanning the room as though the entire scene amused him. Sophie couldn't help noticing how easily Tina navigated the crowd. Her laughter rose above the music like she'd been to this bar more times than she'd admit. Still, for Sophie, having one familiar face here felt like a lifeline. During a lull in the chatter, Dylan finally spoke, his voice directed toward Tina. "You called her Sophie just now," he said, "but you yelled out PK earlier. What's that about?" Tina chuckled. "She's a preacher's kid. That nickname stuck, and none of us ever let her live it down." Sophie managed a tight smile. The label had followed her all her life. Her father served as minister at a modest Methodist church tucked away in the suburbs outside Philadelphia, a role that meant Sophie was constantly expected to set an example she rarely felt capable of living up to. Like many children of clergy, Sophie had rebelled fiercely through adolescence. Though she was bright and quick to learn, she deliberately underperformed in school and seemed magnetically drawn to trouble. By 14, she was sneaking out after dark to meet boys her parents disapproved of and testing every boundary she could find. Her parents' frustration was constant, and Sophie seemed determined to provoke it. And then came the night everything shifted. She remembered it clearly. A warm evening, her boyfriend pulling up outside to take her out. But when Sophie walked up to his car, she stopped cold. There was another girl in the passenger seat. Her boyfriend swore the girl was just catching a ride, but jealousy hit Sophie like a flash fire. She turned on her heel, stormed back into the house, and refused to go anywhere with him. The rest of the evening she spent alone, stewing in her room. Hours later the phone rang. The call shattered her world. Her boyfriend and that girl had been killed in a car crash. Even though Sophie had never truly liked him, her parents insisted she attend the funeral. Sitting stiff-backed in a pew, she felt a hurricane of emotions: grief over the boy's death, shame for her bitter thoughts earlier, and a sharp terror at how narrowly she herself had escaped dying that night. That moment forced her to confront everything she'd been running from. The recklessness didn't vanish overnight, but the edge dulled. She started making changes, pulling back from defiance, taking her schoolwork seriously, even getting a summer job to earn her own spending money. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was the first real step toward it. Seeing the remarkable transformation in their daughter, her parents eventually convinced themselves that the accident, tragic though it had been, must have carried some divine purpose. Armed with her sharp mind and an almost stubborn determination that defined her last 18 months of high school, Sophie pushed herself to excel on the college entrance exams. Her efforts paid off when she secured a place at the Community College of Philadelphia. After enrolling, she began making daily trips to the main campus, determined to earn a business administration degree. Observing how much she had matured, Sophie's father began gently encouraging her to attend the singles events held by his church. Sophie herself had little enthusiasm for such gatherings, but through her father's persistence, she was eventually introduced to Ryan Caldwell, a new member of the congregation in his mid-20s. Ryan was tall, well-groomed, and had neatly styled wavy brown hair. His clean-cut looks carried a quiet charm, though at first Sophie found him only mildly interesting. Her rebellious side had always been drawn to men with rougher edges. Everything shifted when she learned Ryan's profession. He was an FBI agent. The countless movies and TV shows she devoured about the Bureau instantly reframed him in her mind, conjuring images of intrigue and danger. Her curiosity grew, and Ryan, equally taken with Sophie's beauty and her grounded values, soon developed feelings of his own. It wasn't long before they were inseparable. Sophie's parents were thrilled, relieved even, to see their once wayward daughter building a steady future. By the time she earned her associate degree, Sophie and Ryan were formally engaged. "Guess I'm living the dream, huh?" Sophie muttered to her friend Tina one afternoon, the dryness in her tone making Tina raise an eyebrow. "So where is this dream guy of yours anyway?" Tina teased. "You mean SpongeBob SquarePants?" Sophie shot back without missing a beat. Tina blinked, half laughing. "Wait, what did you just call him?" "SpongeBob SquarePants," Sophie repeated, her voice flat. "I call him that because he's such a square, and somehow he manages to suck every ounce of fun out of my life," she added bitterly, making Tina burst into laughter. "Oh, come on," Tina grinned. "I thought you were marrying someone halfway between the Lone Ranger and Elliot Ness." The joke landed closer to the truth than Tina realized. "More like the CFO," Sophie retorted. She paused, softening slightly. "Actually, that might be better. At least an accountant would talk about something interesting. Ryan won't tell me a single thing about his job, and when he's home, he just wants to sit there doing nothing. No adventure, no excitement, nothing." Before she could continue venting, Sophie noticed Ryan approaching from across the room, phone pressed to his ear, and an apologetic look already etched on his face. As soon as he reached them, she quickly made introductions. "Ryan, this is Tina, my best friend from high school," she said, prompting Tina to offer a bright smile. Ryan shook Tina's hand politely, then turned to Sophie. "I'm sorry, honey. Something came up at work. I'm on call, and we'll have to cut the night short." Sophie, who hadn't been eager to attend the wedding reception in the first place, felt her mood sink even lower. The thought of another silent evening at home, staring at the television, filled her with dread. Before she could object, Tina jumped in. "She doesn't have to leave with you, Ryan. Dylan and I can give her a ride later. Let her stay and have some fun." Ryan hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Tina with quiet suspicion. He knew little about Sophie's high school years, but what he'd heard hadn't left the best impression. He wasn't sure how much Tina drank either. Though her date seemed calm enough, something about him still made Ryan uneasy. When Ryan remained silent, Sophie stepped in herself. "Please, Ryan, I don't want to sit at home alone on a Saturday night." When the reception finally wound down, I planned to catch a ride back with Tina and Dylan. "Sure," Dylan agreed after a moment's pause, "but it'll be pretty late by the time I get in." "Don't wait up for me, honey." He pressed a quick kiss to her lips, then turned away to congratulate the bride and groom one last time. The second the door clicked shut behind him, Sophie released a heavy sigh and shot Tina a look of pure relief. Thank you. Seriously, if I'd had to stay one more night cooped up in that house, I would have lost it. Come on, Tina said with a mischievous grin. Let's grab another drink. Before they could make it to the bar, Dylan cut in with a smirk. You two really want to keep sitting around this boring party? Let's blow it off and actually do something fun. Absolutely, Tina agreed immediately, her eyes gleaming. Let's get out of here and go wild. Sophie hesitated, unease flashing briefly across her face. This wasn't exactly what she'd promised Ryan she'd be doing tonight, but the thought slipped away as quickly as it came. If he gets to live his little double life, why can't I cut loose once in a while? Outside, Sophie stopped short when she saw Dylan and Tina heading straight for a motorcycle. Whoa! She laughed, startled. Haven't been on one of those in ages. Are we even going to fit? Of course, Tina said breezily. You hop on behind Dylan, I'll squeeze in at the back. And helmets? Sophie asked carefully. Dylan barked a laugh. Helmets are for amateurs. He swung a leg over the bike and looked back at Sophie, not bothering to hide the way his eyes followed her as she hiked her skirt up to climb on. The rebellious thrill of it sent her pulse racing. Tina settled in behind her, and Dylan kicked the engine to life, roaring away from the reception in a burst of speed. As they leaned hard around a sharp curve, Sophie let out a startled squeal and clutched Dylan's waist. He turned his head just enough to throw her a cocky grin, and she couldn't help but wish, not for the first time, that her husband had even half his edge. By the time they pulled up to their destination, the vibration of the bike and Dylan's closeness had left Sophie strangely restless. A pang of guilt pricked her as she reminded herself that Dylan belonged to Tina. They slipped down a narrow stairwell leading below street level, and Sophie realized they'd arrived at a nightclub. The thrum of bass hit her first, followed by chaotic flashes of colored light slicing through the darkness. For a heartbeat, it felt like being thrown back into her teenage years. She had to resist the urge to dive headlong into the crowd and start dancing right there. Tina made a beeline for the bar. Shots for me, she shouted over the music. You two want one? Before Sophie could answer, Dylan leaned in close, his breath brushing her ear. Want to try something better than booze? He murmured, insistent. Trust me, you'll like it. Sophie pulled back to study his face. There was a dare in his eyes, a quiet challenge she found herself desperate to meet. All right, she said, cautious but curious. What is it? He grinned. Say hello to Molly. Sophie blinked, confused, until he revealed a small tablet in his palm with practiced ease. Without hesitation, he tossed one into his mouth and chased it with his drink. She hesitated for only a heartbeat before following suit, almost defiantly. You're gonna love it, Dylan laughed, voice conspiratorial, and for a moment it felt like they shared a secret no one else could touch. He grabbed Tina from the bar and shouted over the beat, Come on, let's dance! The three of them dove into the crush of bodies on the dance floor, moving in sync with the relentless rhythm. At one point, Sophie leaned toward him and yelled, What about Tina? Doesn't she do Molly too? He shook his head. Nah, she sticks to shots, he yelled back. And right on cue, Tina vanished, reappearing moments later with another drink in hand. The longer they danced, the warmer Sophie felt, euphoria blooming inside her like fire. The pounding bass fused with her heartbeat, and the flashing lights blurred into the sway of her own body, carrying her higher and higher into the music. After some time passed, Sophie dimly realized that Tina had slumped into an empty chair, barely conscious. Dylan left briefly to check on her, leaving Sophie with a strange hollowness gnawing in her chest. Moments later he returned, directing all his focus toward Sophie. His presence was overwhelming, almost suffocating, yet comforting. Inwardly, she wished the night could last forever. Soon after, Dylan effortlessly lifted Tina's limp form onto his shoulder. With his free hand, he reached for Sophie's fingers and guided her outside toward his waiting motorcycle. He placed Tina on the seat ahead of him, draping her across the handlebars in a careless manner. The ride that followed felt endless and fleeting all at once. Time itself dissolved into the rush of wind. All Sophie could process was the sting of cold air whipping against her face. Eventually, the motorcycle slowed in front of an apartment complex deep within the city. Dylan carried Tina inside without a word, and Sophie followed close behind in silence. In the living room, he unceremoniously dropped Tina's unconscious body onto the couch. It was amid that strange, chaotic quiet that everything shifted. When Sophie's eyes fluttered open later, she bolted upright, panic surging through her veins. "What time is it?" she gasped. "Almost 2, Dylan replied, calm and unbothered. Her stomach dropped. 2 in the morning? Oh God, I have to get home. The return trip to her house lasted barely 15 minutes, but to Sophie, it felt unbearably long. Her mind scrambled for a plausible excuse to offer her husband, yet nothing coherent surfaced. When Dylan finally pulled up outside, she jumped off the motorcycle, fumbling for words she couldn't quite form. She wanted to say something meaningful, but all that came out was a breathless, "Thank you, thank you." He responded with a crooked smile, lifted a hand in farewell, and disappeared into the night. Turning toward her house, Sophie felt a creeping dread tighten in her chest. She slipped her key into the lock as quietly as possible, praying Ryan was already asleep. If she could get inside unnoticed, she might concoct an explanation in the morning. Peeking into the bedroom, she breathed out a shaky sigh of relief. Ryan wasn't home. Whispering a silent prayer of gratitude, she tore off her clothes and stuffed them deep into the laundry basket where they'd be hidden from view. For a moment, she considered showering, but the fear of Ryan walking in mid-rinse stopped her. Instead, she threw on a nightgown and crawled into bed, heart racing but easing slightly as she settled beneath the covers. Minutes later, the sound of a key turning in the lock jolted her. Ryan was home. An idea struck her instantly. If she confronted him first with anger, she could set the tone of the story. As Ryan quietly stepped into the bedroom, she snapped on the lamp and demanded, "Where the hell have you been?" The harshness of her voice startled him. He froze in the doorway. "I told you," he muttered. "There was an emergency at work." "That excuse again?" she shot back. "How long am I supposed to buy that? I'm beginning to wonder if you're hiding something, or someone." "No, God, no, I'd never do that to you. I love you," he said, voice shaking. But Sophie stayed in character, refusing to back down. "If that's true, then explain where you really were," she pressed. "I can't," he whispered. "Can't or won't," she retorted, her eyes narrowing. The tension snapped like a taut wire. Ryan, worn thin by exhaustion and her relentless accusations, finally let his guard fall. "It was a crime scene," he said flatly. "I had to go." Sophie felt a flicker of satisfaction. He had admitted something, but she didn't let it show. "Crimes happen every day," she argued coldly. "Why this one? Why all night?" He let out a bitter breath, voice low. "You want the truth? Fine, it was a double homicide. 2 bodies dumped in a landfill." He shook his head as if trying to shake off the image. "That's where I was, while you were off at the wedding, enjoying yourself. Happy now?" The accusation in his tone cut deeper than the words themselves. Sophie didn't reply. The shock etched across her face spoke volumes. Ryan climbed into bed without another word, turning away from her. She switched off the lamp and pulled the blankets close, quietly relieved she had diverted suspicion from herself. The following day, Sophie slept until noon. When she finally emerged, Ryan regarded her with a cool, distant gaze. But as the hours passed, his icy demeanor began to thaw, his tone softening. Strangely, instead of relief, Sophie felt only a deepening sadness pressing down on her chest. Saturday night had felt like a storm, wild, intoxicating, electric. It had been so unlike her everyday life that returning to normalcy felt almost cruel. As the week settled back into its predictable rhythm, the dullness of it all pressed in on her, heavier than ever. The life she had once endured without complaint now grated at her nerves, stirring a restless energy she hadn't felt since adolescence. Running into Tina had been unexpected enough. But Dylan had shaken something deep inside her, an ache she thought she'd buried years ago, a reckless spark, a hunger she hadn't let herself feel since high school. After tasting that kind of thrill, slipping back into her uninspired routine felt like a slow punishment. The following morning, she couldn't summon the will to show up at work. She lingered in her apartment instead, heavy with that familiar morning fog, muted, gray, faintly depressing. She reminded herself she should be grateful to have employment at all. Her degree in business administration had at least secured her a position with the Philadelphia School District, where she worked as administrative assistant to the director of purchasing services. The job was far from glamorous. Worse still was the man she reported to. The director's roving eyes and sly remarks made her skin crawl. He was always hovering too close, pretending to check paperwork while angling for a better view down her blouse or up her skirt. Sophie loathed him, but had learned to endure it, offering a careful balance of forced politeness and calculated glances, just enough to keep her yearly review tolerable. The work itself was monotonous, forms, phone calls, and endless repetition. She was tired of the job, tired of him. But this Monday was already shaping up to be anything but ordinary. When the director stepped out into the reception area to greet a visitor and returned moments later, Sophie nearly forgot to breathe. Walking beside him was Dylan. The man standing before her hardly resembled the one she'd met on Saturday night. Gone was the reckless figure astride a motorcycle, the casual smirk, the glint of a silver earring under neon lights. In his place stood someone entirely different, tailored suit, polished shoes, hair slicked neatly back. He looked almost corporate, almost respectable, but it was undeniably him. Their eyes locked for a single heartbeat. Dylan's lips twitched into the faintest suggestion of a smile. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge her at all, just followed the director into his office. The door clicked shut, leaving Sophie frozen at her desk, heart hammering. 1,000 questions erupted in her mind. What was he doing here? How did he know her boss? And why the sudden transformation? Her curiosity burned too fiercely to ignore. The office still relied on an outdated intercom system, meant for the director to issue instructions without leaving his chair. Sophie had long ago discovered how to reverse it. If she kept the volume low and stayed silent, she could listen in. Reckless, yes, but today, irresistible. The intercom crackled faintly before voices came through. At first, the conversation seemed routine. Dylan introducing himself as a representative for a company looking to supply cleaning products and office materials to the district. Sophie frowned. Dylan, the motorcycle-riding bad boy, moonlighting as a salesman for soap and paper towels? The idea didn't sit right. And the longer she listened, the stranger it felt. Dylan spoke of his company's eagerness to build a relationship with the district. The director's responses were cautious, even dismissive, until Dylan's tone shifted. Our company is extremely motivated to prove our worth, Dylan said smoothly. So much so, we're willing to extend a very particular courtesy. Normally, we pay brokers a 10% commission. In this case, there is no broker. So that same 10% would go directly to you as a gesture of appreciation for helping us get established. Sophie imagined her boss leaning back, calculating. 10%? The director repeated, pretending disinterest. And what's the limit on that offer? No limit, sir, Dylan replied, voice even and assured. Whether you order a few supplies or enough for the entire district, the commission stands. And how, the director asked carefully, would this commission be delivered? Our company avoids unnecessary red tape, Dylan answered easily. I can bring you a cashier's check. Would that be acceptable? Silence followed, a thick, loaded pause. Sophie strained to catch every word. Finally, the director's tone softened, almost genial. Well, he said, purchasing is always open to new suppliers. I believe we can arrange something. A faint rustle came through, paper sliding across a desk. Excellent, Dylan replied. I'll have your commission ready by tomorrow morning. Sophie could practically picture the handshake sealing the deal. She thought the conversation was finished, until Dylan's voice dropped lower, edged with quiet warning. There is one more detail, Mr. Director, he said. In the past, we've had complications. Orders placed, commissions paid, then suddenly canceled or scaled back. To prevent misunderstandings, our policy now requires simultaneous payment at the moment the order is placed. Since our company always disburses commissions using cashier's checks, it only makes sense that payment for the order be made the same way, strictly via cashier's check. Sophie heard the screech of the director's chair legs scraping across the tile. That's extremely unconventional, the principal muttered under his breath. I don't even know if I'm allowed to issue a cashier's check, especially for an amount this large. You're right, Dylan replied smoothly, his tone calm and unshaken. It is out of the ordinary, but so is the commission we're offering. I think you'll agree it's timely. Then, almost casually, he added, Of course, if your policies can't accommodate something this size, we'd completely understand if you wanted to reduce the order. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Sophie leaned forward in her seat, straining to catch every syllable. At last, the principal spoke. No, I believe we can make it work. Just be here before noon tomorrow. I've got a lunch engagement afterward, and I can't guarantee how long it'll run. A lunch meeting? Sophie nearly snorted aloud. She knew for certain there was no such event on his calendar. He just wanted that check cashed as fast as possible. She flicked off the intercom and quickly shuffled papers on her desk as the office door swung open. Thank you again, sir, Dylan purred as he exited. I look forward to a long, profitable relationship between our organizations. He didn't so much as glance at Sophie on his way out. Driving home later that day, Sophie couldn't stop replaying the exchange in her mind. She wasn't a cop, she wasn't even a lawyer, but she knew a bribe when she heard one. Dylan greasing the principal's palms for county contracts didn't shock her. What nagged at her was the insistence on cashier's checks. Why complicate things when the deal was already sealed? Something deeper was going on. She just couldn't put her finger on it. Thinking of the principal made her grimace. His willingness to take the bribe didn't surprise her either. For a fleeting moment, she considered reporting what she'd overheard, but the thought dissolved almost instantly. It wasn't her fight to pick. Still, she couldn't shake Dylan from her thoughts. She hadn't expected to cross paths with him again, and his sudden reappearance dredged up feelings she thought she'd buried for good. That night, he invaded her dreams. The next morning, Dylan strode into the building. The principal nearly tripped over himself, eager to usher him into the office as though entertaining visiting royalty. "No interruptions, Sophie," he barked, barely sparing her a glance. She resisted the urge to roll her eyes. The instant the door shut, Sophie flipped the intercom back on. When the principal inquired about the commission, Dylan's voice radiated confidence. "Yes," he said smoothly. "And to show how committed we are to this partnership, I'm presenting our cashier's check up front, before I even see your payment or order." Sophie could practically picture the principal's greedy fingers snatching the check, eyes scanning every digit like a starving man. Moments later, his voice came through, satisfied. "Everything looks in order. Here's our cashier's check and the signed purchase order, exactly as agreed yesterday. Took some effort arranging a check this large, but here it is." "Thank you, sir," Dylan replied silkily. "You won't regret this. And remember, this arrangement extends to all future orders. It will prove extremely rewarding for everyone involved." "Very well," the principal said at last. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have that lunch I mentioned." The men left the office, and moments later the principal announced to Sophie that he'd be gone for the rest of the afternoon. She nodded politely, told him she'd take her lunch break as well, then grabbed her coat and bolted the second they were out of sight. Weaving through midday traffic, Sophie's thoughts churned. She wasn't sure exactly what she was stepping into, only that she had to see it for herself. She finally parked outside the same crumbling apartment complex she'd spotted Saturday night. Staying in her car, she waited, watched, hoped she'd guessed right. Not long after, Dylan's car pulled up. He climbed out and strode toward the building. Sophie jumped from her vehicle. "Dylan, wait!" she called. He turned sharply. Surprise flickered across his face before caution settled in. "Sophie," he said flatly, "come inside." Holding the door open, he led her into the vacant apartment. Inside, he folded his arms, eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. Sophie ignored the question. "I overheard everything," she said quietly. "The deal with the principal, the bribe." "So?" His voice was calm, almost bored. "You planning to turn me in?" Again, she sidestepped the question. "No, because this isn't just bribery. I don't believe for a second that you're actually selling anything. You're running a con. That check you gave him, it's fake, isn't it?" A slow, crooked grin curled Dylan's lips, though his eyes stayed cold. "You're sharper than I gave you credit for," he said. "Yeah, the whole thing's a scam. The check I handed him, completely worthless. But the one he gave me, the school district's check, that one was real, and I've already cashed it." "What happens if the principal actually tries to cash it and realizes it's counterfeit?" she whispered, fear and curiosity tangled in her voice. "Wouldn't he go straight to the police?" Dylan's smirk deepened, self-assured and untouched by doubt. "That's the genius of it. Either way, he's cornered. The only way to out me is to confess he took a bribe, and believe me, he won't risk that. Not until someone starts asking uncomfortable questions about why the school suddenly ran out of supplies. By then, I'll be gone, untouchable." His eyes hardened, sharpening like blades. "All right then, how much is it worth for you to keep your mouth shut?" "I don't want your money," she said evenly, her voice steady as stone. For the first time, his composure cracked, surprise flickered across his face. "No? Then what is it you want?" She stared at him without blinking. "Take me with you." The request left him silent. He studied her face carefully, then leaned back, a slow, sly grin creeping back to his lips. "You're serious?" he asked, mocking yet intrigued. "You're ready to walk away from your doting husband? The tidy little house, the predictable job, the quiet suburban life? You're willing to throw all of it away? For me?" A wild glimmer burned in her eyes. "I've waited my entire life for someone like you. I'm done with this place. I'll be outside your house in an hour. If you're not there, I won't wait." "We're taking the bike?" she asked breathlessly. "No," Dylan replied flatly. "I'll have the car. Sometimes, if you want to survive this life, you leave the toys behind." "And Tina?" she asked, cautious but determined. "Same answer," he said, voice cold as steel. "If you're coming with me, you leave it all. Be at your place by 1:30, or don't bother looking for me again." Sophie kissed him hard, then ran for the door. She sped to the nearest bank branch, heart pounding, and drained both her personal and joint accounts. From there, she raced home and began throwing her life into a single suitcase. Clothes, toiletries, a handful of keepsakes shoved in without thought. As she headed downstairs, she snatched a scrap of paper to leave a note for Ryan. What could she possibly say? At last, she scrawled 2 simple words. "I'm sorry." She placed it on the kitchen table, laid her wedding ring beside it, and walked away. On the front steps, she sat waiting, pulse hammering in her ears. Doubt slithered into her mind. This was insanity. She had never done anything remotely this reckless. Every instinct screamed to stop, to run back inside, to stay safe where she belonged. Then headlights cut through the night. A plain sedan eased to the curb, unremarkable in every way. Sophie bolted upright and ran toward it, leaving the door behind her unlocked. Her bag thudded into the trunk. She climbed into the passenger seat without a word. Dylan drove away in silence. As the city blurred past the windows, Sophie's thoughts wandered to Ryan. Guilt churned her stomach. She knew she'd broken him. She imagined her parents' faces, their disappointment when they learned what she'd done. "None of that matters," she told herself fiercely. "This is my life now. No one controls me. I know what I want, and I'm taking it." The months that followed felt surreal, like drifting through someone else's dream. Dylan took them south to Wilmington, where they holed up in a dingy motel that didn't ask questions and rented rooms by the week. Life blurred together, half vacation and half runaway honeymoon. Nothing was planned. They lived moment to moment, untethered. Sophie thrived in it, sleeping until noon, partying until sunrise, answering to no one. The life she'd abandoned felt like a distant, faded photograph. Sometimes Ryan's face would haunt her thoughts. Sometimes she'd picture her parents, wondering if they hated her now. Each time she shoved those ghosts aside with a bitter mantra. That was then. This is now. I make my own rules. I do whatever I want. So when Dylan shook her awake one afternoon, she was caught off guard by the words that followed. "We're out of money," he said bluntly. "Time for you to start working." Still half asleep, she rubbed her eyes and scowled. "Doing what exactly?" He didn't bother to answer the question. "You're going to be a legal secretary." She stared at him, stunned. "But I don't know the first thing about legal work." "You don't know the first thing about pigeon work," he said evenly, his tone flat but not unkind. "But you will soon enough." He let the words hang for a beat before adding, "First stop is a little shopping." After they finished lunch, the pair made their way to Nordstrom at the Christiana Mall, just outside Wilmington's downtown. In the women's section, Sophie caught sight of Dylan a few racks over, pretending to browse but clearly keeping watch. She drifted toward the skirt displays and quickly spotted it. A sleek black pencil skirt by Alexander Wang, its sharp silhouette broken by a daring zipper-trimmed slit. The moment her fingers brushed the fabric, she felt it. This was the piece she needed. She flagged down a sales associate for her size and slipped into the fitting room. The fit was flawless. Stepping out, Sophie returned the skirt to the display, but not perfectly aligned with the others. She angled it outward just enough to find again later. "I'll check a few more things," she murmured to the salesgirl with casual ease, then wandered over to the blouse section. There she found a crisp white button-down with long sleeves, perfect for the corporate look they were aiming for. Recalling Dylan's advice, she grabbed a size smaller than she usually wore and tried it on. The reflection in the mirror matched exactly what she needed it to be. She hung the blouse back, leaving it subtly protruding from the rack like a secret marker. Next came shoes. In the footwear department, she cycled through pair after pair until she found them. Sleek black stilettos, understated yet expensive, carrying a price tag of $300. She didn't hesitate. She paid cash on the spot. When it was done, Sophie wandered to the food court and claimed an empty table. Minutes later, Dylan appeared, a bulky chump sports bag swinging from one hand. "Did you get what we needed?" she whispered, her nerves visible in the tightness of her grip. He nodded once. "Maybe we should go," she urged under her breath. "No rush," he replied, tone calm and almost bored. "We're good." "How can you be so sure?" she pressed, anxiety edging her words. "Simple," he said with a faint shrug. "Nobody thinks a guy's swiping women's clothes. Maybe someone kept an eye on you, but no one even notices me." "Then why make me buy those overpriced shoes?" she asked, her unease still simmering. "3 reasons," Dylan answered, raising fingers as he counted them off. 1. Shoe clerks watch like hawks. You can't lift footwear without being clocked. 2. Designer shoes like these are chipped. You can't leave without the tag being deactivated. And 3. Dropping 300 cash on stilettos? That kills suspicion dead. No thief spends like that. Sophie stayed tense, but when they finally made it back to the motel, the relief was almost dizzying. Dylan flicked on the Weather Channel and sat in silence, watching the forecast scroll by. After a few minutes, he clicked the TV off and muttered, "Tomorrow's ideal for dove hunting. That's our play." A tight knot formed in Sophie's stomach. She despised the idea of joining Dylan's schemes. It was one thing to turn a blind eye to what he did. It was another to help him do it. But there was no way out, not one she could see. By noon the next day, she was making her way nervously down Delaware Avenue toward DuPont Park, dressed head to toe in the stolen outfit. The secretary disguise looked convincing enough, she hoped. Up ahead, across the street and half a block forward, Dylan was already in position. When she reached the edge of the small park, he gave her the faintest signal, a flick of his hand. Following his cue, she veered toward the fountain. An older man sat alone on a nearby bench, maybe 60, with thinning gray hair and a tired face. His suit and tie were worn, the cuffs fraying, the collar faded. Sophie drew a sharp breath. Time to move. "Excuse me, sir. Sorry, I think you dropped this," she said, offering him a plain manila envelope. The man turned toward her slowly. His eyes darted to the envelope, then back to her face, lingering just a fraction too long before he finally spoke. Sophie sensed the purpose behind Dylan's insistence on the outfit she now wore. He had planned every detail, and she silently admired his foresight. "I'm sorry, miss," the elderly gentleman murmured kindly, a faint smile creasing his weathered face. "That isn't mine." "Are you positive?" Sophie asked softly, her curiosity shining through her politeness. "I spotted it beneath the bench right where you're sitting." The man gave another slow shake of his head, firm but courteous. "No, not mine, but thank you for checking." Settling onto the bench beside him, Sophie's gaze followed his. She caught the fleeting glance he stole toward the slit in her skirt and cleared her throat, extending the envelope she had picked up. "What should we do with this?" she asked, noting the weight in her hands. "It feels unusually heavy." He accepted the envelope, hefted it briefly, then passed it back to her. "Maybe there's a note inside, a name, an address, something that'll tell us who it belongs to," Sophie suggested, meeting his eyes deliberately. "That's a clever idea," the man said, his voice warm with the pleasant surprise of sharing the moment with her. With careful fingers, Sophie unsealed the envelope and slid out its contents. Her breath hitched, followed by a dramatic gasp. "Oh my God, this is cash!" she exclaimed, thrusting the envelope toward him. The man's eyes widened instantly as he peered inside. "How much is it?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling in disbelief. He withdrew the neatly banded stacks, counting swiftly. When he finished, the color drained from his face. 20 bundles, he whispered. "Each is $2,500 bills. That's $50,000. Sophie stared at him, stunned. "Do you think we could keep it? There's no name, no clue who it belongs to. 25,000 apiece." He faltered, clearly torn between temptation and caution. "We should turn it in to the authorities. Someone might be looking for it," he said carefully. Seeing Sophie's disappointment, he added quickly, "But if no one claims it, then maybe it's ours." An idea flickered in Sophie's mind, sparking a sly smile. "My boss is an attorney. His office is across the street. Let me call him. He'll know what to do." Before the older man could object, Sophie had already dialed. Her voice, confident and bold, carried through the brief conversation. When she ended the call, she looked back at him. "He's on his way to a meeting, but he'll swing by here first," she said, then pointed suddenly. "There he is now." Striding toward them was Dylan, impeccable in a navy suit, crisp white shirt and striped tie, his heavy briefcase swinging rhythmically at his side. After Sophie introduced them, she relayed the entire situation. Dylan opened the envelope, studied its contents carefully, and then spoke in a grave tone. "I know exactly what this is," he said at last. "It's drug money." Sophie's breath caught. "Drug money? Then what are we supposed to do?" "Report it to the police," Dylan replied firmly. "The good part? Once the paperwork clears, whoever found it usually gets to keep it." Sophie let out a squeal of delight and threw her arms around the elderly man, who chuckled and returned the hug. "Wait," Dylan interrupted, raising a hand. "There's a complication." Both Sophie and the man turned toward him anxiously. "This envelope is part of a laundering scheme," Dylan explained. "They stash unmarked cash, wait for someone to find it, and once it passes through the system, it becomes clean money." "We're not criminals," the old man protested. "I believe you," Dylan said calmly, "but convincing the authorities will be another matter." He paused for effect, letting the gravity of the situation settle before continuing. "There's a way to prove you're acting in good faith. Put some of your own money alongside what you found. No trafficker would ever risk doing that." The older man hesitated. Sophie, quick to seize the moment, spoke up first. "That makes sense," she agreed. "How much do we need to add?" "Half," Dylan said evenly. "If you both match half the total, it proves you have nothing to hide." Sophie didn't flinch. "I've got just over 25,000 in savings at the bank across the street," she said eagerly. "If this doubles it and clears our names, I'm in, especially since we're handing it over to the police anyway." She turned her head toward the man sitting next to her. "And what about you? Could you manage something like that?" He hesitated, his silence stretching long enough for her to jump in. "My husband and I are desperate. We need $25,000. I'm guessing that kind of money would do you a lot of good, too." The older man nodded slowly, the weight of the decision settling over him. Yes, we could use it," he admitted finally. "I can take $25,000 from my retirement account. My bank's just around the corner." "Perfect," Dylan muttered, his voice low and urgent, eager to keep things moving. "Here's how this has to work. You both need to withdraw the cash. While you're doing that, I'll stay in contact with the police. Ask the teller to put the bills in an envelope with the withdrawal slip inside and have them seal it. That way there's proof of where it came from. As soon as you've got it, meet me back here." Sophie grabbed the stranger's hand and pulled him up from the bench, her excitement slipping through her careful tone. "Come on, let's go now." He didn't resist. Taking her hand gratefully, he stood and followed her out of the park. They crossed the street together before parting, he heading toward his bank, she toward hers. When he returned minutes later, chest rising and falling from the rush, Sophie was already waiting with an envelope clutched in her hand. Dylan took both envelopes, tore one open just enough for the contents to be visible, and showed them the combined $50,000 inside. Then he sealed it firmly. "There," he said with satisfaction. "Now the police will know nobody tampered with it." He glanced at his watch, impatience flickering across his face. "Where are those detectives?" Turning away, Dylan pulled out his phone and made a call, his voice low and tense. Sophie and the older man couldn't hear the whole conversation, but the fragments they caught hinted at trouble. Covering the phone's microphone, Dylan looked back at them. "Change of plans, they've been delayed. 15 minutes maybe." His gaze swept the park before returning to them. "I'm not comfortable standing around here with this much cash. We need to put it somewhere safer." He faced the gray-haired man. "Your car close by?" "Yeah," the man said quickly. "First level of the garage, just over there." "Good," Dylan replied with approval. "We'll lock it in your trunk. I'll tell the police where to find it." Ending the call, Dylan gestured for them to follow. The three crossed the street toward the parking garage, the older man leading the way. "That's mine," the man said, pointing to a mid-row Chevrolet. As they approached the vehicle, a sharp clang rang out, metal striking concrete. Sophie gasped softly. "Oops, I dropped my phone." She knelt, feeling along the ground until her fingers found it. Standing, she held it up toward him. "Think it's okay?" He took it to check, concern flickering in his eyes. Behind him, unnoticed, Dylan smoothly switched the sealed envelope for an identical one from his briefcase. By the time Sophie and the man turned back toward him, Dylan was already holding out the new envelope. "Pop the trunk," Dylan instructed. The man unlocked the trunk. Dylan tossed the envelope inside and slammed the lid closed with deliberate force. There, much safer. Another glance at his watch, another sigh. "If I don't leave now, I'll miss my meeting. The police should be here any second. Wait for them here by the car." Before either could respond, he strode briskly toward the exit and vanished. The older man shifted uncomfortably, scanning the garage. Sophie touched his arm lightly. "So," she asked with a gentle smile, "what's the first thing you'll do with all that money?" The question brightened his face instantly. He began talking about dream vacations in Europe, long postponed trips, and luxuries he'd never thought possible. Sophie nodded and smiled as he spoke, letting him lose himself in the fantasy. When he finally paused for breath, she grimaced slightly. "Ugh, I really need a restroom. I'll duck into the bank and be right back." She kissed him lightly on the cheek. "Don't go anywhere," she teased, then jogged toward the bank's entrance. But she didn't stop inside. Moving straight through the lobby, she exited out the far side, turned down a narrow alley, and disappeared from sight. Dylan sat behind the wheel, the low purr of the engine vibrating through the quiet night. The car idled for a moment before he finally eased it onto the road. Beside him, her hands shook, still buzzing with adrenaline. "So? How'd I do?" she blurted, her voice electric with nervous excitement. "You nailed it, sweetheart," Dylan said, flashing a grin. "Couldn't have done it better myself." He added almost proudly, "That's how a perfect pigeon drop looks." A sly smile tugged at her lips. "Think he's figured it out yet? That envelope stuffed with nothing but newspaper." "Won't cross his mind for a while," Dylan replied, calm and certain. "By the time it does, we'll be long gone." Her laugh came out wild, bubbling over as she leaned back in her seat, the thrill still clinging to her. The car drifted toward the rundown motel they'd been calling home for weeks. When Dylan turned into the cracked parking lot, he cut Sophie a sharp glance. "Go on inside. Wait for me there. I've got a stop to make." "A stop where?" she asked, confused. "At the Bank of Moscow," he said, his tone almost playful. "The Bank of what?" she repeated, startled. "Never even heard of it. Why do you have to go there?" "Better if you don't ask," Dylan said flatly. But when he saw her expression falter, he softened a little. "When I get back, we'll do something fun, all right?" Alone in the motel room, Sophie's thoughts wandered back to what they'd just pulled off. The thrill had burned away, leaving something heavier in its place, a hollow ache she couldn't quite name. The image of the man they'd conned clung stubbornly to her mind, his fraying coat, his shaking hands. She pushed the guilt down hard. "He's probably got plenty socked away somewhere," she told herself. "He won't even miss it." Still, the weight in her chest wouldn't budge. She'd chased the rush of running with someone dangerous, but she hadn't counted on being dragged so deep into his world. Dad would blow a gasket if he knew, and Ryan would never forgive me. The thought stung enough to make her angry. Why do I even care what they'd think? She rifled through Dylan's bag, found a joint, and lit up. By the time Dylan came back, her high was soft and dizzy, her stomach growling from the munchies. He laughed when he saw her sprawled on the bed. "Come on, baby," he said, amused. "Let's grab some food. Maybe have a little fun after." A week later, Dylan dropped the bomb. "Time to move," he said. "Soon as I get back, we're gone." "Where are you going now?" Sophie asked. "Business," was all he gave her. When he returned, they threw their lives into bags in minutes, tossing them into a dented sedan that wouldn't draw a second glance. Dylan paid off the motel clerk and pointed the car north onto I-95. "Heading back to Philly?" Sophie asked. "Nope," Dylan said shortly. "Newark." "Newark? Why Newark?" she pressed. "Business opportunities," he muttered, eyes on the road. "What kind of opportunities?" Dylan exhaled, the sound sharp with irritation, like he was explaining something to a kid. "Fine, we've got time, so listen up. Remember that job I ran in Philly with the school board?" "Yeah," she said. "This one's like that, only bigger. Play it right, we walk away set for years." "Couldn't you do something like that in Wilmington?" she asked. "Doesn't work there," Dylan said, shaking his head. "Newark's a gold mine. Biggest school system in Jersey, worst graduation rates in the state. It got so bad the government took it over back in '95. Total disaster. No money, bad management, bleeding cash everywhere." "Doesn't sound like money to me," Sophie muttered. "That's where you're wrong," Dylan said, a spark of excitement in his voice. "Because everyone knows about their problems. The donations keep pouring in. Zuckerberg alone dropped $100 million into it. Every rich guy with a savior complex is throwing cash at them. They're desperate for fixes, any fixes. And that's where we come in." She still looked lost, so Dylan spelled it out, voice dropping low. "Their newest miracle plan? Hand every kid a laptop and hope grades magically go up." Sophie snorted. "Yeah, right. They'll just sit on Facebook all day." "Exactly," Dylan said, grinning. "But it doesn't matter if it works. All that matters is the money. We're going to sell them a whole shipping container of iPads at a bargain price. They'll line up to buy." Sophie stared at him. "And where exactly do we get a shipping container full of iPads?" "Our friends at the Bank of Moscow already lined one up," Dylan said easily. Sophie leaned toward him. "Okay, you've got to tell me, what is this Bank of Moscow?" "Not a bank," Dylan said with a smirk. "Just what I call them. Russian mob. They bankroll scams, shady deals, whatever turns a profit. And why wouldn't they just run the scam themselves? She asked. Simple, Dylan said with a shrug. They get their cut without ever getting their hands dirty. What if the whole operation falls apart? Sophie's voice quivered, a sharp thread of panic woven into it. What happens if the people they're fronting collapse, or worse, end up behind bars? Dylan didn't flinch. His reply was level, almost clinical. These aren't banks we're talking about. You borrow from them, you pay them back. Principal and interest, period. Prison time doesn't buy you mercy. They'll come after your family if they have to. There's no loophole, no way to slip the noose. Sophie's brows drew together, her voice tight. And if the family can't, or refuses? A faint shudder ran through Dylan, like a memory brushing against him. You don't want that answer. The BOE always collects, always. One way or another, the debt gets settled. Sophie hesitated, then pushed on. Fine, but where did these Russians even get their hands on a container full of iPads? Dylan shot her a flat look, incredulous. Where do you think? They stole it. And they're just giving it to us? She said, confusion etched into her voice. Not giving, Dylan corrected slowly, like explaining something obvious to a child. They're loaning it to us, plus fronting cash for the setup. In return, we hand over 50% of the profit. Half? Sophie's eyes widened, outrage slipping into her tone. We're the ones risking everything, and they just walk away with half? That's insane. Yeah, it's steep, Dylan admitted with a shrug. But where else are we going to clear $2 million in one shot? $2 million? Sophie blinked at him. You're not serious. Do the math. Dylan's voice was calm, confident. 10,000 top-line iPads, 128 gigs each. Retails $1,800 a pop. We sell them to the school system for 50% off. They think they're getting a miracle deal, and we're suddenly the good guys. 4 million total. Split it down the middle, 2 million clean. He grinned sideways at her. With that kind of cash, we're untouchable. We could disappear anywhere. But Sophie didn't share his excitement. Unease still flickered in her expression. You really think you can talk a school board, anyone actually, into buying stolen goods? She asked skeptically. Dylan's grin only widened. Our contacts say the guy running point is Gregory Stanton, head of the Newark Today's Future Foundation. He's ambitious, wants a political career. And let's just say he's not picky about where his funding comes from. He's persuadable. And your plan is to con him? Sophie asked, incredulous. Not me, Dylan said, his eyes lighting with amusement. You. Me? Her voice cracked with disbelief. I wouldn't even know where to start. Relax, baby, Dylan murmured smoothly. I'll be right there with you. With your face and my coaching, this'll go down like butter. The next day, after checking into a no-frills motel near Newark Airport, they drove into Manhattan to prep Sophie for her new role. Hours later, they returned with armfuls of shopping bags, lace lingerie from Agent Provocateur, a tailored charcoal Armani suit from Saks, and knee-high black suede Burberry boots with slender heels. As before, Sophie paid for only one thing herself, the boots, peeling off cash with no questions asked. That evening, Dylan drilled her on every detail. How to sell the pitch, what questions Stanton might throw at her, how to deflect if he wavered. He'd already set up the meeting with the Foundation's office, presenting her as April Johnson, Vice President of Sales for Global Resources. Most brands blur together, Dylan explained, pacing the room. Get them thinking about the payout and they'll convince themselves you're legit. Once they see the prize, they'll want to believe every word you say. Sleep barely touched Sophie that night. Anxiety gnawed at her gut, not just about the role she was about to play, but about how deep she'd already sunk into Dylan's world. Yet there was no off-ramp now, not without crashing everything. She'd chosen her side. By dawn, her stomach was so knotted she couldn't choke down a bite of food. The meeting loomed ahead, heavy and electric, like thunderclouds rolling in on the horizon. After slipping into the tracksuit and tugging the laces of her boots tight, a faint wave of calm washed over her chest. Moments before she climbed into the cab bound for the Foundation's headquarters, Dylan leaned close enough for his breath to brush her ear. "Don't forget, sweetheart, you've got something no one can ignore. You're gorgeous. Any guy would have to be out of his mind to say no to you." Sophie clung to those words like a lifeline, praying he was right. The moment she stepped into Stanton's office, she cut straight to the point. The lines she and Dylan had rehearsed spilled effortlessly from her lips. She laid out the offer. Global Resources had secured a massive shipment, 10,000 top-tier iPads, the $1,800 models, for pennies on the dollar. Her company was willing to sell the entire batch to the Foundation at half price, provided it bought the whole lot. Even as she spoke, the proposal sounded outrageous to her own ears. She braced for laughter, or worse, a sharp dismissal. But then she noticed something. Stanton wasn't fixated on the numbers at all. His eyes kept drifting toward her, lingering a moment too long. To test her suspicion, she casually crossed her legs, then uncrossed them. Sure enough, his gaze followed the movement like a child staring through a toy store window. A flicker of confidence sparked in her chest. "I can use this." Dropping the rigid business talk, she shifted her tone to warm admiration. She praised the Foundation's mission, layering her compliments with subtle nods to Stanton's leadership. When his guarded expression began to soften, she pushed further, describing the ripple effect this tablet initiative could unleash. Public schools equipped with premium technology, headlines glowing with praise, political doors swinging open. "The people of Newark are starving for a visionary," she said, voice smooth as silk. "Someone who refuses to shy away from tough problems. A project like this could change everything, for the right person." Her voice dropped, intimate now. "My company wants to back that kind of leader. In fact, we're willing to contribute directly to the campaign fund. 1% of total sales, treated as commission." Stanton's brow furrowed as he did the math aloud. That could definitely bolster a mayoral run. Before he could finish, Sophie cut in, just as Dylan had drilled into her. "No, Mr. Stanton, not 1% of the discounted offer we're giving you. 1% of retail value." His eyes went wide. $80,000? "Exactly," she replied, allowing herself the faintest, carefully measured smile. For a long second, he stared into nothing, calculations and possibilities flickering behind his eyes. Then his focus snapped back to her face. "You've given me plenty to think about, Miss Johnson," he said slowly. "I only wish I had a little more time before committing to a final decision." Her smile widened, warm but calculated. "Of course, Mr. Stanton. But I'm sure you understand. Inventory moves fast. We can't hold this deal forever." He studied her, weighing her words. Finally, he gave a short nod. "Let's reconvene tomorrow, same time." She rose smoothly, extending her hand with perfect composure. "I'll be looking forward to it," she said, then glided out of his office with practiced grace. By the time she reached Dylan, adrenaline was thrumming through her veins, nearly making her dizzy. "Dylan, oh my God, I think this is actually working," she burst out. "He hardly questioned me, and when I hinted what this could mean for him—" "You know what that means, babe?" Dylan cut her off, voice low with raw excitement. "If this lands, that's $2 million. $2 million. We can vanish, go anywhere, live however we want." The next morning, Sophie walked back into the building for the follow-up. Another sharp business ensemble, borrowed but convincing, framed her like armor. When she entered Stanton's office, she carried herself with quiet poise. His greeting confirmed what she had already guessed. "Miss Johnson," he said with deliberate weight, "I've reviewed everything you sent. And I have to admit, it's extremely persuasive." He's in, Sophie thought, fighting to keep her grin from spilling across her face. "As I dug deeper into the case, I came across something unusually compelling," Stanton said, leaning in as if about to share a closely guarded secret. About 9 months ago, a school district in Philadelphia signed a massive deal to acquire cleaning supplies from what looked like a legitimate vendor. But the shipment never came. That single missing delivery triggered an internal investigation, which eventually exposed something far darker. The procurement chief had been bribed, and the entire supplier was a sham. The moment Sophie heard those words, the thrill she had clung to collapsed into pure dread. Oh God, he knows. They're probably outside already. Are the cops about to come bursting in? Her chest tightened, her heartbeat roared in her ears, and sweat pooled under her arms. It took everything in her not to sprint for the exit. But the detail that really caught my attention, Stanton went on, unfazed by the panic written across her face, was the form of the bribe. It wasn't cash, it was a cashier's check. And, in a cruel little twist of fate, that check turned out to be just as counterfeit as the contract itself. Sophie felt her legs wobble. For one irrational moment she wished she could simply faint and escape the humiliation. Stanton's lips curved into a smug grin. George Santayana once said, "Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it." I have no interest in reliving such unpleasant lessons, which is why I'm prepared to accept your offer, but only under 3 strict conditions. Miss even one of them and we're done. Sophie's mind reeled. Wait, he's not turning me in? He's actually considering a deal? She struggled to catch up to the shift in tone. Stanton didn't wait for her to respond. First, the political contribution your firm is promising must be paid entirely in cash, and handed over at the same time as the merchandise. By now, Sophie had regained some composure, but that demand clenched her stomach into knots. $80,000? In cash? How are we supposed to manage that? Outwardly, she forced her face into an unreadable mask. My second condition, Stanton continued smoothly, is that I personally examine the goods. I won't sign off until I've laid eyes on all 10,000 iPads myself. Sophie stayed silent. The quiet dragged on until Stanton cleared his throat and added, "My third condition is somewhat more personal." He paused deliberately, savoring the tension. "Before we close the deal, you'll spend the night with me at the Meadowlands Hilton." Sophie's breath hitched. She shot to her feet, horror etched across her features. For a split second, she wanted to scream, to strike him, but instead, she forced herself back into the chair, jaw locked, hands trembling violently. When she finally spoke, her tone was low and measured. "I didn't expect this from you, Mr. Stanton. Honestly, I find your demand disgusting. I'll have to discuss this with my colleagues before I give you any answer. Good day." With that, she rose again and headed for the door. Stanton's voice followed her like a whip crack. "Don't wait too long, Miss Johnson. My offer won't stay open forever. Inventory moves quickly, as I'm sure you understand." Sophie gritted her teeth and refused to look back. When she returned to the rundown motel, Dylan read her face instantly. The tight jaw, the hollow eyes. "What happened?" he demanded, before she even had a chance to drop her bag. "What went wrong?" Sophie recounted everything, the cash demand, the product inspection, and finally, the unthinkable proposition. Dylan listened in silence, brow furrowed, but oddly unshaken. "Didn't see that coming," he admitted after a moment. "But it's not impossible. I'll reach out to the Russians. We can make it work." The inspection didn't worry him either. "They've already got the shipment in Newark. I'll arrange a viewing when I call about the $80. Could actually help us." Sophie snapped. "No, Dylan, it doesn't help, because I'm not sleeping with that pig," she shouted. "What?" Dylan blinked, then broke into a grin. "That's his third demand? He wants you? That's fantastic." "Fantastic?" Sophie stared at him, stunned. "Don't you get it?" Dylan said, eyes lighting up. "If he's crossing that line, he's hooked. We've got him exactly where we want him. This is perfect." Sophie shook her head in disbelief. "I'm not a prostitute, Dylan. I'm not doing it." His hand clamped down on her shoulder hard enough to make her flinch. "Grow up, Sophie," he barked. "This is the game we're playing. You use whatever leverage you've got, and you've already been using it to sell. Now use it to close." Tears welled in Sophie's eyes. "And what about us?" she whispered. What happens to us if I do this? Dylan softened instantly. He slid an arm around her, tilting her chin so she had to meet his gaze. Baby, he murmured, I'll love you even more if you pull this off. This is like winning the World Series. One night with a guy like him means nothing compared to what we're about to pull off. Sophie searched his eyes, desperate for reassurance, but beneath her yearning, unease twisted in her gut. From the outset, she had no interest in being part of the scam. And yet, here she was, growing increasingly aware that Dylan was taking advantage of her. The look he gave her only heightened her discomfort. Still, despite the unease, she yearned for his validation, hungry to win his approval. She couldn't lie to herself. The lure of what this scheme could bring was undeniably powerful. After an uneasy pause, she reluctantly agreed, telling Dylan she'd go along with his plan. Once she gave in, Dylan immediately shifted gears. The negotiations with Stanton were far from complete, and he already had the next move mapped out. Now that he's on the ropes, Dylan said thoughtfully, we can turn the money itself into a bargaining chip. Following Dylan's directions, Sophie called Stanton to accept the terms and scheduled a meeting at a hotel 2 nights from then. Stanton sounded thrilled, almost overly so, until Sophie abruptly cut through his excitement. There's a stipulation, she said, her voice calm and cold. If you want the campaign funds in cash, then we expect the payment for the computers to also be in cash. His reaction was instant and furious. Stanton's shouting exploded through the phone, his outrage filling the air. But Sophie remained composed. Justice goes both ways, she interrupted firmly. Just like you don't want to get duped with a fake check, we can't afford to be stuck with fraudulent orders. It protects everyone, no confusion. He grew more irate. How the hell am I supposed to come up with $2 million in hard cash? He shouted. Even if I could, the largest bill is 100. Do you realize how much that weighs? Sophie quickly muted the call and looked over at Dylan, her expression tight with concern. He met her gaze with calm assurance. Don't lose your cool, he said softly. She turned the audio back on. If cash won't work, suggest a different form of payment, she told Stanton. If not, we walk. His tirade continued for a while, but eventually his tone began to soften. After a long silence, he offered an alternative. What about Eurobonds? They're liquid, practically cash. We've got a decent reserve in our fund. I can use those instead. Would that work? Sophie glanced at Dylan, who gave a non-committal shrug and jotted a note on a scrap of paper. I'll need to run this past our financial team, she said smoothly. I'll get back to you within the hour. As soon as the call ended, Dylan immediately contacted their Russian connection and explained the situation in detail. He listened carefully as the voice on the other end provided guidance. Well, Sophie asked, her nerves barely contained. Eurobonds are issued by European corporations and governments, Dylan explained, pacing as energy surged through him. They're bearer bonds. Whoever has them can redeem them. According to the Russians, they're often used for money laundering. If these are clean, we can treat them like actual currency. Sophie frowned. So what does that mean for us? It means he's on the hook, Dylan replied with a grin. He wants this deal so badly, I bet he's already dreaming up campaign slogans. Once the adrenaline settled, Sophie returned Stanton's call and confirmed that Eurobonds would be an acceptable substitute. The deal was locked in. At first, a rush of triumph swept through her, but as time dragged on, her feelings swung wildly. Dylan lavished her with compliments, never missing a chance to emphasize that the con relied on her performance. She basked in the attention, relishing the rare feeling that she truly mattered to him. But doubts were never far behind. She often felt like just another piece on Dylan's chessboard, one he'd move or discard without a second thought. The most unsettling thought was the fear that Dylan might one day pressure her into selling herself. The mere possibility enraged her, and the fact that he might consider it at all only made that anger more intense. Despite all this, 2 nights later, Sophie stepped into the lobby of the Meadowlands Hilton. She had arrived ahead of schedule and picked a quiet spot far from the main entrance. The dinner with Stanton stretched across several courses and too many bottles of wine. He went on and on about the Foundation's efforts, painting himself as the mastermind behind every success. Sophie kept her composure, offering polite smiles and nods where appropriate, though her thoughts were elsewhere. Then, mid-sentence, she noticed a man across the room who bore an eerie resemblance to her father. The similarity was so striking it sent a surge of memories crashing through her. She could almost hear his disapproving voice. "You can't act like that, Sophie. That's not how good girls behave. People will notice." Her jaw tightened. "I'll do whatever I please," she told herself fiercely. "You don't get to control me, not anymore." In that moment, every shred of uncertainty evaporated. Without hesitation, she leaned over the table and cut Stanton off mid-thought. "That's really interesting," she interrupted sharply. "But why don't we take this bottle upstairs and continue in your room?" Once they were inside, she took command without delay. The door barely clicked shut before she grabbed the wine, took several long swigs straight from the neck, and dropped it on the nearest surface with a dull thud. A moment later, they were tangled together in a blur of limbs and lips until fatigue finally dragged them both into sleep. Hours passed. She stirred, dazed, her surroundings briefly unfamiliar. The sparkling Manhattan skyline beyond the window snapped her memory back into place. As the details of the night surged back, a fierce sense of satisfaction surged through her. She had played her part flawlessly, deceiving the man who, soon enough, would be handing over $2 million in hard cash. "Let's get down to business," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "This is how it's going to go," he continued, his tone firm and absolute. "Tonight, 5 o'clock sharp, meet me at my office. Bring $80,000 in a briefcase. Come alone. If anyone else shows, the whole thing's off. The Euro bonds will be there. You'll count them. I'll count the cash. If we're both satisfied, we take it all to a secured vault I've arranged. You'll bring a padlock. So will I. We both lock it. No surprises, no touching." His voice dropped a note, becoming cold and deliberate. "With everything locked away, we head to the docks to verify the iPad shipment. Once I confirm they're legit, we return to the vault, open it together, and walk away with our respective cuts." He gave her a moment. "Understood?" She gave a small nod. "Good. No games," he said, holding her gaze with a frosty intensity. "No games," Sophie echoed, pushing down the growing disgust curling in her stomach. "Everyone gets what they came for." He offered her a tight, joyless smile before turning and leaving. When Sophie got back to the motel, Dylan was pacing anxiously outside their door, his nerves obvious. The second he saw her, he launched into a barrage of questions. She recited everything Stanton had said about the arrangement. Dylan listened, brow furrowed in concentration. "It'll take some finesse," he murmured, "but I think we can make it work. I'll reach out to the Russians, get the next phase lined up." He walked off, leaving her behind to gather their things. As she packed their few possessions, anxiety crept in where adrenaline had been. The bold confidence she'd worn like armor the night before had begun to fray. Stanton's demeanor that morning had exposed the cracks in her facade, and now all she felt was the heavy throb of shame. She tried to convince herself it didn't matter, what anyone thought, what she had to do, but even she didn't believe it. She turned instead to daydreams of what lay ahead, the freedom, the possibilities, the places they could go. Paris. She let the word form in her mind like a prayer. "I've always wanted to see Paris." She imagined herself under the shadow of the Eiffel Tower, wandering down elegant boulevards, eating beneath soft candlelight in tucked-away cafes. The fantasy lifted her enough that when Dylan came back, she was able to greet him with a fragile sense of hope. He stepped into the room, lugging a briefcase that looked far too heavy for its size. "We're set," he announced crisply. He tapped the case. 80,000 right here. Guard it like your life depends on it, because if anything happens to it, the Russians won't hesitate to tear us apart." The image sent a chill through her. "So, how exactly is this supposed to go down?" she asked. "You're better off not knowing," Dylan shot back immediately. "What you don't know, you can't accidentally reveal." She stiffened at the distrust in his voice, but said nothing, allowing him to continue. "There's one last thing you need to do to close this deal," he added, outlining her part with clipped precision. When he was done, she gave him a faint but steady smile. "I can do it." Just before 5, Dylan stopped the car in front of the Foundation's building. Sophie climbed out, clutching the briefcase with both hands. It felt heavier than anything she'd ever held in her life. "Just hold tight, darling. 60 more minutes and we're rolling in money," Dylan said, his tone warm and steady. Sophie edged toward the towering structure, clutching the briefcase tightly against her chest. Dylan had carried it for most of the trip, and she was still baffled by how ridiculously heavy, neatly stacked bundles of $100 bills could be. At the entrance, Stanton was already pacing, his movements twitchy until he spotted her. He extended a hand for the case, but Sophie instinctively pulled it closer. "Easy," he said, voice even, both hands raised in mock surrender. "No one's taking anything. I just need to verify the amount." He motioned toward a steel container resting on a nearby folding table. "The Eurobonds are right there. Feel free to inspect them." Without hesitation, Sophie stepped forward, undid the latches, and flipped the case open. She scanned the pristine bonds, swiftly tallying their face values. Then she pulled one from the center of the stack, snapped a photo with her phone, and uploaded it to the secure server she'd prearranged. A few moments later, her phone vibrated. A brusque voice came through, laced with a heavy Slavic accent. "They're legitimate, go ahead." She didn't allow any emotion to show, though relief quietly settled in her chest. She gave Stanton a slight nod. "Perfect," he replied, closing the lid with a firm click. "Let's move." Each of them took hold of their respective cases and walked briskly toward his waiting Mercedes. They drove in silence for several miles until the car eased to a stop outside a weathered, remote self-storage facility. Sophie must have looked doubtful because Stanton threw out a quick explanation. "Trust me, no one ever comes out here. Total discretion." He parked in front of a storage unit, jumped out, and unlocked the roll-up door with a metallic rattle. The space inside was almost empty, save for a single metal shelf bolted to the far wall. He set his case on it and gestured for Sophie to follow suit. "They'll be fine here until we're back from the docks," he said. After pulling the door shut, he refastened the lock. Sophie then produced a small padlock from her purse and clipped it onto the latch. "Now it takes both of us to open it," she said with finality. Stanton hesitated, then gave a short nod of agreement. "Great, let's move," she said, slipping into the passenger seat. "We've got a mountain of iPads to inspect." The car cruised eastward, then curved southward along the Lincoln Highway. At Port Street, Stanton made a sharp turn and veered onto Corbin Street, entering the sprawling industrial labyrinth that was Port Newark. Shipping containers stretched as far as the eye could see, rows upon rows of steel giants painted in bold reds, blues, and yellows. Overhead, crane arms swung like hulking predators waiting to strike. Following Dylan's directions, Sophie guided them through a snaking path of container lanes until they reached a narrow corridor flanked by stacked cargo. "Here," she said, pointing toward a bright blue container. She withdrew a paper from her purse and compared the serial numbers stamped on the metal doors. A perfect match. "This is it." Handing over the key, she stepped aside as Stanton unlocked the padlock and pushed one of the doors open. The 40-foot container was crammed with massive cardboard boxes, each one branded with the unmistakable Apple logo. Stanton, suddenly animated, pulled out a pocket knife and sliced open one of the cartons, revealing tidy rows of smaller boxes inside. He tore one open and lifted an iPad, grinning with childlike glee. "Told you," Sophie said flatly. Then, echoing Dylan's earlier reminder, she added, "You'd better check the ones at the back, too. Make sure they all match." "Good call," Stanton replied, already clambering over the larger boxes to reach the rear of the container. As soon as he was deep inside, Sophie sprang into action, rushing for the heavy door, throwing her weight against it in an effort to slam it shut. The metal hinges shrieked, loud enough to draw Stanton's attention. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he yelled, rage flashing in his eyes as he turned toward her. Panic kicked in. Sophie fought with the locking bar, trying to latch it shut, but it jammed halfway and refused to slide into place. Stanton leapt down, charging toward her. Heart pounding, Sophie abandoned the door and fled, sprinting between the towering containers until she hit the open road beyond. Stanton thundered after her, but she dove into Dylan's waiting vehicle just in time. Cursing furiously, Stanton turned back and sprinted for his own car. He tore out of the cargo lane, determined to follow, only to screech to a halt as a massive 18-wheeler slid in front of him, blocking the exit entirely. Boiling with rage, Stanton slammed his car door open and charged out, yelling at the driver to get the truck out of the way. The man responded in a language Stanton couldn't make sense of. Unbothered, the driver and his companion began unloading wooden crates, completely ignoring his fury as Stanton stood helplessly on the curb, cursing at the top of his lungs. Inside a speeding car leaving the container lot behind, Sophie clung to her seat, visibly shaken as Dylan navigated the streets toward the warehouse. "It felt like trying to run underwater," she said, voice quivering. "I kept thinking he was going to grab me." Dylan shot her a sideways smirk. "Relax," he told her. "Stanton's stuck. The truck guys know exactly what to do. They're stalling him for an hour minimum. By then, we'll be ghosts." "But won't he call the cops?" she asked, voice laced with worry. Dylan let out a dry laugh. "And let them find the stash full of untraceable cash and bonds? That'd end his career faster than a scandal. He won't risk it." When they finally reached the storage unit, the place felt abandoned, eerily silent. Sophie hurried ahead, reaching Stanton's locked room, and thrust the key into the slot. While she fumbled with the lock, Dylan popped the trunk and hauled out a massive pair of bolt cutters. He tried and failed multiple times to cut through the latch until frustration took over. With a grunt, he ditched the tool and instead wrenched the door handle up with brute force. It groaned open. "There we go," he barked in triumph and rushed inside. Sophie trailed behind as Dylan tore into the cramped space, rifling through its contents in a frenzy. Then he spun toward her, grabbed her by the shoulders, and shook her hard. "Where are they?" he shouted. "Where the hell are the briefcases?" Sophie wrenched away from him, stumbling toward the metal shelf. "They were right here," she said, voice breaking. "I swear they were right here." "He must have taken them," Dylan blurted, trying to make sense of it. "No," she yelled. "I saw them with my own eyes. They were still on that shelf when we locked up." Dylan clasped his head in his hands and let out a low, strangled groan. When he raised his eyes again, his face was gray with dread. "Oh no," he murmured. No, this is bad. We're finished. The Russians are going to kill us." The fear in his voice struck her like a slap. Panic surged up in her chest. "It wasn't our fault," she cried, eyes filling with tears. "Someone else must have taken the money. They'll understand, right? They have to." "You don't get it," Dylan snapped, eyes wide with terror. "There's no forgiveness with them. You cross these people, you disappear. We're already dead." Sophie grabbed his arm desperately. "Please, we can fix this. We'll talk to them. Promise to pay it back. We'll find another score." "Get off me, you useless bitch!" Dylan exploded, hurling her to the ground. Her body smacked against the cold concrete, a bolt of pain shooting through her hip. She stared up at him, stunned, as he spun around and dashed for the exit. "Don't leave me!" she screamed, scrambling to her feet. But Dylan didn't stop. He jumped into the driver's seat and jammed the key into the ignition. Just as the engine roared to life, two black SUVs roared in from opposite ends of the driveway, blocking him in completely. Their doors flung open, large, imposing men poured out, storming toward Dylan's car. He barely had time to react before they dragged him out, secured his wrists, and shoved him into the back seat of one of the vehicles. Sophie stood frozen, paralyzed by the sight. Then rough hands clamped down on her arms, twisting them behind her. Plastic cuffs bit into her skin as they cinched tightly around her wrists. She was yanked toward the other SUV. Inside, more restraints wrapped around her ankles, locking her in place. Helpless, she looked over at Dylan, just in time to see a man pull a sack over his head. Her heart stopped. A second later, the same coarse material was pulled over her own face. "Please!" she cried, her voice muffled and distant. "Shut your mouth!" a gruff voice barked back. She obeyed, Fear snatched the words from her throat. The vehicle surged forward, tires screeching on pavement. Sophie's mind spiraled into chaos. She couldn't stop thinking about the night Ryan had told her about a gangland execution, the way he described it, every sickening detail. It had seemed like fiction then. Now it felt terrifyingly real. Tears streamed down her cheeks, mixing with the snot dribbling from her nose. She sobbed, gasping for air under the stifling fabric, but the panic only made it worse. Someone has to notice, she thought desperately. Someone has to see this and call for help. But then she remembered the SUV's blacked-out windows. No one could see inside. This isn't right, she told herself. I'm not a monster. I don't deserve this. But then Ryan's face came back to her. And his wife's. And that old man in Wilmington, the one they'd scammed. His haunted eyes. The truth clawed its way into her chest. Maybe she had earned this. Her thoughts drifted to her own family, to the beliefs her father had once tried to pass on to her, the ones she'd dismissed as naive and outdated. For the first time in forever, she wished she'd listened. In her mind, she began desperately bargaining with God, promising to change everything about herself, to be gentler, more compassionate, completely transformed, if only he would let her survive. But the more she tried to pray, the more her thoughts dissolved into silence. No words came. Her will drained away, and she slumped against the seat, consumed by hopelessness. A faint noise broke through the silence, a stifled sob. She turned her head and saw Dylan trembling. So he's terrified too, she thought grimly, and to think I once believed he was the brave one. The car spun around a sharp corner, sending her crashing into the side. Pain ignited in her hip, a cruel reminder of how Dylan had tried to abandon her to save himself. Rage surged in her chest, at him, at herself, at every foolish decision that had landed her in this nightmare. The vehicle jolted again, rough and sudden. The sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires told her they'd veered off the road. Dread closed around her like a fist. A scrapyard, she realized in horror. And then the tears came in broken gasps. The SUV screeched to a halt so violently that she nearly hit the seat in front of her. A door opened beside her, and she shrieked as hands gripped her legs. "Don't move," barked a gruff voice. The plastic around her ankles was torn away. Before she could react, a powerful hand seized her arm and yanked her from the vehicle. She could hear Dylan stumbling nearby as they were herded across uneven, sharp terrain. 20 yards, maybe more, and they were forced to stop. Unyielding arms shoved her downward until her knees hit stone. The pain should have registered, but terror had already drowned everything else out. "How much time?" a voice asked from somewhere in the dark. 5 minutes, another answered. At first it made no sense. Then the words slammed into her like ice water. 5 minutes left to live. Her knees buckled, but someone hauled her upright with brutal strength. She knelt, shaking, her breath shallow and fast. Footsteps came from behind. Then, suddenly, light blazed through the burlap sack on her head, probably headlights, and a hand clamped against her skull, yanking the sack away. The brightness blinded her. For a moment all she could see were a pair of polished shoes planted firmly before her. Then a voice, rough and cutting, sliced through the air. "This what you wanted?" Sophie froze. That voice, she knew it. Ryan. "This the life you pictured for yourself?" he asked, the words raw with betrayal. Hiding, running, tied to someone like him? There was no denying it now. It was him, Ryan, her ex-husband. His voice shifted, softer, but brimming with pain. "I would have given you everything, Sophie. Anything. I would have taken a bullet for you." Shame rolled through her like a tide. She curled inward, unable to lift her gaze. "Here." His voice snapped like a lash. She flinched as his hand moved to his jacket. She braced herself, expecting a weapon. But instead of a gun, he tossed an envelope at her feet. "This what you wanted so bad?" he said, voice laced with venom. "There, divorce papers." He stared at her a moment longer, then turned from her and spoke to the others waiting in the shadows. "I'm done. Keep them both." Then he stepped out of the light. A voice behind him spoke calmly. "All right, everyone, that's it. Let's get back to work." Rough hands pulled Sophie and Dylan upright. Their wrists still bound, they were marched back to the SUV and shoved inside. An envelope landed in Sophie's lap, probably the same one Ryan had thrown down. A few seconds later, the SUV roared back onto the highway, heading southeast. It was Dylan who broke first, fury erupting through his fear. "What the hell just happened?" The passenger up front turned around. Sophie blinked. A composed, striking black woman stared back at her, face calm and unreadable. "Call it a professional courtesy," she said evenly. "One of our agents wanted a final word with his ex-wife. We let him add some theatrics." Dylan narrowed his eyes. "FBI?" He gave a cold, humorless laugh. "Of course. How long have you been watching us?" The agent gave a soft laugh. "Watching you? Please. You two were never the target. You were bait. We used you to draw out the real threat. Russian organized crime. They all went down today." Dylan's expression changed, understanding dawning, followed quickly by fury. He turned toward Sophie, voice shaking with blame. "You took everything out of the locker." The agent smiled faintly. "Naturally, evidence. Dylan's glare could have cut glass. "You filthy traitors," he growled, voice thick with hate. The female agent didn't flinch. "Careful how you talk," she shot back. "You should be grateful, actually. If we hadn't intervened, your Russian buddies were set to put a bullet in both your skulls the second you picked up the money." She didn't wait for him to respond. "We've been monitoring both your crew and theirs for weeks. Every detail of their setup, we heard it all." Sophie let out a long, shaky breath, and whatever bravado Dylan had been clinging to drained from his face like someone had pulled the plug. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "So, where are you taking us now?" For the first time, the agent turned to look at her directly, her face unreadable. "Where do you think? Essex County Jail," she replied, blunt as a slap. "Or did you think you'd get a ride back in a town car?" Then her gaze lingered on Sophie, her eyes narrowing with a mix of judgment and bewilderment. "Answer me this. Why in God's name would you throw away Ryan Caldwell for that waste of space?" Sophie dropped her eyes, unable to withstand the intensity of the question. "I don't know. I've always fallen for the wrong type," she mumbled. "The wrong type?" the agent scoffed. "You mean him? The same coward who pissed himself back there?" The agent driving groaned in disgust. "Wait, seriously? He wet his pants? Great. Guess who's cleaning the back seat again?" His partner laughed, then turned her mocking attention back to Sophie. "You were chasing danger?" she said acidly. "You were married to one of the toughest damn agents this coast has ever seen. The guy's got medals most of us will never even come close to. He's gone after mobsters, nailed bank thieves, tracked down killers. And that," she motioned toward Dylan with a scornful jerk of her thumb, "is who you left him for." Sophie's voice was barely audible. I didn't know," she said quietly. "No, you didn't," the agent snapped, "and you nearly ruined him for it. There were days we weren't sure he'd even make it after you walked away. He loved you more than you ever realized, and you crushed him." She inhaled sharply and held the breath a moment, clearly fighting to keep her composure. "But after what happened tonight," she said, her voice softening, "he'll bounce back, and when he does, every woman in the Bureau will be lining up to shoot their shot. Hell, I might be first in line." The driver let out a loud laugh. "Damn it, Amber, I thought we were friends." She gave him a playful swat on the shoulder. "Shut up, Rick. Your wife would strangle you if she heard that." Before the banter could continue, Rick cut in. "Show's over," he said, swinging the wheel hard as the car screeched into the lot of the blue-trimmed Essex County Correctional Facility. They rolled to a stop outside the intake entrance. Sophie and Dylan were hustled out of the vehicle and ushered down antiseptic hallways, the hum of fluorescent lights above them and the rhythmic clomp of boots echoing off cold concrete. Partway down the corridor, one of the female agents grabbed Sophie's arm and steered her sharply to the right, pulling her away from Dylan. Without a word, she was shoved into a barren holding cell. The heavy door slammed shut behind her with a deafening clang. She crumpled onto the narrow cot bolted to the wall, her body quivering with fatigue. Her mind raced in a whirlwind of emotions. Residual adrenaline, the terrifying brush with death, the brief comfort of survival, and the sinking weight of knowing she might soon have to face Ryan again. She kept reliving Dylan's betrayal, that moment he tried to run, abandoning her to save his own skin, and felt a grim, bitter comfort knowing he was finally out of her life. Even if he hadn't bolted, she thought grimly, the Russians wouldn't have let them leave alive. What had she been thinking? How could she have tossed everything aside for someone like him? Her thoughts turned to what the agent had said about Ryan. That woman clearly saw a man Sophie had never taken the time to understand. She sees him as a hero, Sophie realized, a strange ache forming in her chest. A deep mechanical rumble somewhere in the facility broke her from her thoughts. She looked up, staring through the iron bars of her cell. Reality was setting in, cold and suffocating. This was only the beginning. The thought of spending endless years locked away drained all hope from her soul. What hurt the most was the inescapable truth. She had no one to blame but herself. Without warning, the female agent reappeared, her presence silent and still behind the bars. She inserted a key into the lock, turned it, and swung the cell door open. "Follow me," she said, her tone brisk and emotionless, then turned and led Sophie through a tight hallway that ended at a closed door. The instant it opened, a blast of cold night air rushed against Sophie's skin, sharp, unreal, and almost dreamlike. They emerged into a parking lot where a vehicle idled, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Sophie paused, staring at the agent in confusion. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice unsteady. The woman offered no explanation, only gestured toward the car. The back door opened and someone stepped out. Someone she never expected to see. "Dad?" Her voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. When she realized it really was him, her legs gave out beneath her and she stumbled forward, collapsing into his embrace. She clung to him tightly, burying her face in his chest as tears streamed down her cheeks, soaking his coat. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she cried, her voice raw with guilt. "I'm so sorry for everything." He held her close, his own voice thick with emotion. "Let's go, sweetheart," he said gently, guiding her to the passenger seat of the car. As she settled in, still trembling, she asked, "Where are we going?" "Home," he replied softly. "I don't get it," she said, voice shaky and bewildered. "Why am I being released? How did you even know where to find me?" They turned onto Doremus Avenue, the road stretching toward the New Jersey turnoff. He glanced sideways at her, his voice low. "Ryan called," he said. "He asked me to give you a message." "What message?" she asked. "He said, think of it as a goodbye gift from SpongeBob." A broken sob tore from her throat, and she collapsed into tears once more. Sophie couldn't tell if Ryan's final act was one of compassion, or the most painful parting gift he could have left her.